Micah 5 begins with an ominous portent of judgment. It says, "Marshal your troops, O city of troops, for a siege is laid against us. They will strike Israel's ruler on the cheek with a rod." Now the rod was the symbol of royal authority. And whether this is literal or metaphorical, this is a humiliating blow for the king in Jerusalem, for the man sitting on the throne of David. Now it speaks of both the near future, as Assyria sweeps aside Jerusalem's satellite towns and advances on the city. And it also speaks of over 100 years later, when Babylon razed Jerusalem to the ground and carried off both king and people. And Micah is a prophet of God, and he's looking into the horizon, and it's as if God is showing him storm clouds of divine judgment, and some of those clouds are nearer and some of them are further away. And there is a kind of blurring here of time periods. And yet, as this second oracle of Micah draws to an end, there's good news. Because the clouds, and I'm going to adapt to him here, the clouds Israel so dread are big with mercy and will break in blessings on their head. The king in Jerusalem, he's a pale shadow of the great David, but there is coming a greater than David, a king worthy of the name, one who's going to bring security and strength for his people, one whose power is going to be at work in and through his people. So in this chapter, Micah 5, we have the story of that king and his remnant people. So let's consider the king first of all. Now, when we think of Judah at that time, they were a people full to the brim with confidence in themselves and with humanistic things. They were trusting in military might, in money, economic strength, the walls of Jerusalem, the temple, in anything but the true God, which was exactly why judgment was coming. And yet God says that when his divinely appointed Messiah arrives, he's not going to come from any of those obvious things or obvious places. It's going to be very, very unlikely. And we get this famous verse that's often quoted at carol services. Verse 2. "But you, Bethlehem Ephrathah, though you are small among the clans of Judah, out of you will come for me one who will be ruler over Israel, whose origins are from old, from ancient times." So Bethlehem, it's about 5 miles south of Jerusalem, and it was a town so insignificant, so small, that in Joshua 19, 115 different towns and cities of Judah are listed, and Bethlehem isn't even mentioned. It just wasn't thought of. It was that kind of obscure a place. And Micah says that God is going to do something very different. He's going to ignore all the upper class elites in Jerusalem, all the expected pathways of salvation, and he's going to do something different and unexpected. Now, place names are very important to Micah. If you remember back in chapter 1, Micah lists the many towns and villages of the Shephelah, or Shephelah. I'm not sure if I pronounced that right. Thank you, Gordon. I won't try it. But it was a rich, fertile plain, a land to the west of Jerusalem, and it was full of nicer, trendier, more significant places than Bethlehem. If you were on the look for a house, that would be the postcode area you'd buy in, not Bethlehem. And yet, as Micah says in the first chapter, none of those places live up to their names. The Assyrians are going to sweep through the region, and they're going to capture and destroy town after town. And in chapter 1, Micah gives us this series of ironic word plays to show that these places, which should have been places of blessing and safety, were actually places of destruction where the enemy came in and took over. And yet when we get here to chapter 5, and little neglected Bethlehem Ephrathah, well, it's a very different story. Bethlehem, as most of you will know, means house of bread. Epaphra means bountiful. And God is going to richly provide for his people, because out of this bountiful house of bread, this unthought of place, he will provide a Messiah. He will provide a king who will be the bread of life. And it's just lovely to see, isn't it, how God works. It's how he's always worked in human history. And it's how he's still working today. His salvation is always contrary to human expectations. He works through the weak things, the despised things, the foolish things, to shame the strong and to make it abundantly clear that salvation is not of us. It's from him and him alone. Now, Bethlehem did have one claim to fame, because the great David was born there. David grew up there. It was his hometown. But that was over 300 years previous. And by Micah's day, Bethlehem wasn't even living off faded glories. It had quickly sunk back into obscurity. And in fact, David himself in his day, if you remember, had been a very unlikely and a very obscure candidate for Israel's king. He was a shepherd boy, and he was the youngest son of Jesse. So all the social convention would have said, well, not David. And yet by faith, David trusted in God. And God raised him up as his instrument of salvation. And that's the message here to God's people, to the remnant in Judah, to the few godly people that there were, at a time when the nation are trying to look to worldly strategy and trust in human strength, money, resources, and judgment is about to break as a result. Micah says to these godly people, your hope is to be found in the Lord, and his ways are not your ways. They never have been, they never will be. And if you doubt this, just remember your own national history. Just remember tiny Bethlehem. And remember that shepherd boy, this unlikely figure who trusted in God, and he defeated a giant and he conquered a kingdom. And your hope is to be in the Lord and in one greater than David, but who, like David, will be an unlikely saviour from despised Bethlehem. Now, the link to David is stressed by that phrase, whose origins are from of old, from ancient times. So this future king will trace his lineage back 300 years to David. But it's not just talking about that, is it? His origins are far older than that, because this king is the very king that Daniel describes as the Ancient of Days, the one John calls the Word, the one that was with God, the Word that was God in the beginning. And this divine king, this Ancient of Days, God's Messiah, he's going to be a king, and he's going to be everything that a king should be, and more. He's going to be the epitome of what a true king really should be. And he'll be like David, only greater. He will be a shepherd. We're told in verse 4 that he will stand and shepherd his flock in the strength of the Lord, in the majesty of the name of the Lord his God. Now, ancient shepherding is a tough job. I think sometimes when we think about shepherds, we think it was quite sweet and, lots of fresh air. It was quite pleasant, beautiful hillsides and, very romantic picture. But it was not like that. It was tough. It wasn't for the faint-hearted. We know that from David's experience. He was having to fight off mountain lions and bears. And the thing about shepherding was, you didn't sort of sit down and have a little picnic and just sort of casually watch the sheep. You were forever standing. You were poised, ready to protect the flock, to help them, to guide them, to step in at a moment's notice. And this shepherd king, we're told, stands and shepherds his flock. He stands firm amongst his people. It's not a cocksure, arrogant, self-focused strength. Now, most people live in fear, not just because they're perhaps afraid of invasion from enemies, but often it's because they fear their own leaders. But this isn't the brute strength of the tyrant who rules his people with fear. This shepherd stands in the strength of the Lord, in the majesty of the name of the Lord, his God. So his strength comes from his own personal relationship with God. Now, because this great leader, this king, this shepherd, is so firm and strong, and yet so wonderfully gentle, and so very much in step with his God, his people can live without fear. They can live securely, Micah says. And that's an amazing thing to say, given the increasing instability of the day Micah spoke in. And we see the same insecurities in our day, don't we? And yet Micah's saying that under this king, this gentle shepherd, there's rest, there's security, there's peace. And yet there's a paradox here, because this very gentle, loving, kind shepherd ruler isn't a weak king. He's not a lackey of the ruthless Assyrians or the Babylonians. This king's greatness will surpass even them. We're told it will reach to the ends of the earth. When will this be? Now, clearly, this wasn't physically realised in Micah's lifetime. We're not talking about a king like Josiah or anyone like that. And it wasn't even physically realised in that sense afterwards. We know that one glorious day at the end of time, it will be, when God's people will be the only people on the face of the earth. Yes, there'll be many, many tribes and tongues represented and nations represented in that people, but it will be just one people. And the vision of Micah 4 will be fully realised. But, having said that, in another sense, this has been fulfilled, hasn't it? Micah's not just exclusively speaking of the end of days. He's not the modern prophet who's obsessed with what's going to happen just before Jesus comes back. As I said earlier, as Micah speaks and as he prophesies, he sees those storm clouds of judgment, and some of them are near and some of them are further away. And he sees plenty of pain ahead for Israel. In fact, he sees 7 centuries of pain for Israel. But he sees it to a fixed point. And verse 3 says, "Therefore Israel will be abandoned until the time when she who is in labour gives birth, and the rest of his brothers return to join the Israelites." It's 7 centuries of upheaval. When Israel went into captivity, came back, different nations took control of her. She was never as prosperous again. She was sort of caught between pillar and post. It was a time of judgment, and God was judging Israel all through that time. But it will reach this point when this woman in labour will give birth. And she'll give birth to the shepherd king. And suddenly the storm clouds of judgment will pass. Because the judgment for sin will fall upon that shepherd, the one hanging on a cross. And through his death, and through his resurrection, the gospel age will be ushered in. And I think that's what these verses are particularly speaking of here. These verses are a beautiful picture of the gospel age, our age, where the remnant trust in Jesus for the forgiveness of sins, and in him they're given peace with God. Micah speaks of peace in verse 5. He says, and he will be their peace. And he's not just thinking of absence of war, but shalom, well-being, inside and out, relational peace with each other, but most importantly with God. Peace with God. The peace of right relationship with the Creator. Because he will be their peace. And this is what the angels spoke of, isn't it, in Luke 2? Peace on earth, goodwill towards men. It's what Paul speaks of in Ephesians 2. Peace between man and between God and man. A peace made by Christ in his body. The good shepherd who laid down his life for the sheep. In fact, I think verse 1 perhaps speaks of that true king, because Israel's true king was struck on the cheek, wasn't he? And he was scourged and he was beaten. He was nailed to a cross. He was utterly humiliated. The judgment of God fell upon him, and in so doing he made peace. And then he rose. But he remains. Although he rose, he remains in our midst, in the midst of his church. and looking to him, resting in him, serving him, we're secure. No matter what the outward storm, and there's lots of outward storms at the moment, we know that the condemnation of our sins has been removed and judgment has been removed in and through Christ. This is the shalom, the blessedness that I think David speaks of in Psalm 23. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside quiet waters. He restores my soul. He guides me in paths of righteousness for his name's sake. And even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I'll fear no evil, for you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. That's life under the Good Shepherd. That's the measure of the rule of this King, the Messiah, God's Son, the perfect righteous ruler of God's remnant people. And it's a remnant that will swell and will grow and ultimately be found in every part of his earth. And one day we will be the only people in this earth. That's what's coming up. Micah sees it. Beyond the storm clouds. Now, what of the remnant? What of God's people? That's really the focus from verse 6 onwards to the end of the chapter. And as I've said, I think we're considering particularly here the gospel age. Our age. Micah's generation looked ahead to it. We see it in full because we live in it. And it is a glorious day that we live in. It's a day the Old Testament prophets couldn't imagine. When the law of God is written in our hearts, when we can worship God anywhere, anytime, in any place, where Christ lives amongst us. And yet, it's not paradise on earth, is it? I mean, I really enjoy our Bible studies, but it's not quite paradise on earth. Not yet. Until the return of Christ at the end of days, when God returns to dwell on the earth forever, that vision in the first part of Micah 4, until that time, there will still be conflict. There will still be wars to fight. It's the now and the not yet. That's the gospel age. And Micah, using the symbols, the language of his day, speaks of this conflict. He speaks of Assyria, who were the big, bad empire of the day. And he speaks of the land of Nimrod, which is another phrase for Babylon. If we were writing it today, we would speak of the unsaved world around us. We might speak of Satan's domain. This is the world we live in. It is a world where we will be required to fight. There will be conflict. But the point is, Christ, the Good Shepherd, the King of his people, does not leave his people unprotected. Verse 5, when the Assyrian invades our land and marches through our fortresses, we will raise against him 7 shepherds, even 8 leaders of men. They'll rule the land of Assyria with the sword, the land of Nimrod with drawn sword. There's a lot of metaphorical, pictorial language here. The shepherds mentioned are under-shepherds, serving under Christ's authority, representing Christ, being Christ to the flock. And if 7 is the number of perfection or the number of completion, then the number 8 suggests abundance. Christ's provision for his flock is overflowing. There'll be no lack. Now, remember the time that this is written in. Jerusalem's leaders in that day are described by Micah as being almost like cannibals. They tear the skin from my people and the flesh from their bones. In other words, the wolves had got into the sheep pen and were masquerading as shepherds. And far from being protected and nurtured, the sheep were being ripped to shreds. And Judah was heading down the path of disaster. But Micah says that Christ, the Lord, the King, the Messiah, is going to raise up an ample provision to protect his people. Now, in fact, we see the Lord raising up shepherds even in the near future from Micah's day. You only have to go through less than 100 years and you have godly King Josiah, possibly the godliest of the kings other than David. And we have a great prophet like Jeremiah. And we have the great Daniel and Ezekiel in Babylon. And we have Mordecai, Esther in Persia, and then we have Nehemiah with the exiles back in the land. So even before Christ comes, God is already raising up his rulers to shepherd his people. But in the light of Christ's redemptive work at Calvary, his people, us, the church, how much more amply we're provided for. And I find this encouraging because, we can be quite negative at times, can't we? You've probably heard it said, "Where the godly men? We lack godly leaders in this day." And Micah says, well, we don't actually. They are there. Throughout the gospel age to this day, God's church will always have pastors and elders and shepherd-hearted men and old and young who are watching out for the flock. And this won't end until Christ comes back. So we should be encouraged. Christ has got our backs. Christ is watching over us, and Christ has raised up an abundance of under-shepherds. Sometimes we don't always see them ourselves. We don't spot them. We don't encourage them. But they're there. We are amply provided for by the Lord. And the thing that's particularly noticeable to me about these verses 5, 6, 7, the picture it gives us is not of a holy huddle. It's not churches, retreating from the world, battening down the hatches, waiting for Christ to come. That's not the picture Micah gives us at all. Not a bit of it. The church is where the action is. The remnant, verse 7, the remnant of Jacob will be in the midst of many peoples. That's where the church is, in the midst of the peoples. And verse 6, doesn't it, speaks of decisive action. And when we think about the church in the gospel age, well, we wield the sword of God's word. And we possess the shield of faith. And we have the Spirit of Christ in our midst. And we go out into the world. We live in the world. We preach to the world. We witness to the world. We share. We live. We do good. We represent Christ to a dark world. And through his power, we gain territory for his kingdom. The enemy is not going to have it all their own way. I think that's the message here. Yes, it's a time of conflict and there will be difficulty, but the enemy doesn't have it all his own way. In fact, the enemy will be driven back and the gates of hell won't prevail against God's church. In fact, something interesting will happen to the church in this time. Now, I don't know if you've ever heard it said that people often tend to resemble their leader. So if their leader is think of a football team, if the manager is bold and aggressive, they'll tend to instill those kinds of qualities in their team. Now, if that manager's perhaps quiet and thoughtful, such qualities will be encouraged in that leader's followers. If that leader's negative and pessimistic, so their followers will be. The leadership of a person, it rubs off on the people that sit under that leader. Now, if that's true of human leaders, how much more true is it of the Church of Christ under his leadership? There will be an increasing sense that the Church of Christ will begin to resemble Christ. There will be the unmistakable whiff of Jesus in our lives. And it will affect the world in two very different ways. So on the one hand, it says in verse 7 that the remnant will be like dew from the Lord, like showers on the grass, which do not wait for man or linger for mankind. Now, Israel, during the summer months, could be a very hot, dry land. The land was parched. And in that parched land, the heavy dews that would come up to water the ground were an incredible blessing. It was vital, life-saving refreshment. And in the same way, the rain shower that perhaps fell right in the middle of a period of drought, that was life-saving. And Micah's saying that in the wilderness of our world, where Satan has got his teeth into people, where people are miserable, enslaved to sin, and when they're famished, worn out, what a blessing the church can be. A breath of fresh air in the stale, toxic fumes of sin, bringing a message of hope, shining light into dark places, showing the value of love, living out peace, preaching Jesus to the world. We're the only people who've got the answers. We are a means of grace to a sinful world. I don't think we'll ever quite realise until we get to heaven just what an impact godly Christians can have in a street, in a neighbourhood, perhaps in an entire village or town. It might be that there's a village or a town in this country where there's only a handful of true believers. But they can have such an impact, such a means of blessing to that place. And yet, on the other hand, verse 8 says that the remnant will be like a lion among the beasts of the forest, like a young lion among flocks of sheep, which mauls and mangles as it goes, and no one can escape. It's a rather graphic image, isn't it? But the church in that sense is like that powerful, fearsome lion. It will bring judgment and death. For those who hear the gospel message we preach and we share and we live out, and they just reject it out of hand, and they ridicule us, and they persecute the church, well, sad to say, they are heaping condemnation and judgment upon themselves. Because you see, the church is divisive, just as Christ was divisive. God will use us and work through us for his glory, and some people will be drawn through the witness of the church, and others will be repelled by the same church and the same message. It's what Paul says. I don't know if you've ever noticed this very interesting verse in 2 Corinthians 2, verse 15. For we are to God the aroma of Christ among those who are being saved and those who are perishing. To the one, we are the smell of death. To the other, the fragrance of life. And who is equal to such a task? That's a rhetorical question, but I think we could probably ask it of ourselves. Are we equal to the task? We're not, are we? I think we all know that. But if Christ is among us, then he will work through us. We can be sure of it. So I think, you see, the thing to worry about as a church is not when opposition flares against us, because it's clear that's to be expected and Christ is in it. The thing to worry about is when there's nothing. When the church neither draws nor repels, because it stands for nothing. That's when we should be worried, because that's the church where the candlestick's been removed, where the Holy Spirit is not present. But where Christ is present through his Spirit, we will be both the smell of death and the fragrance of life. Perhaps in the same area, to the same family. One of them is drawn, the other one is repelled. And that's a humbling thing, it's a sobering thing, isn't it? Do you remember when he was commissioned by God? And Jeremiah was told by God, I have put my words in your mouth. I appointed you over nations and kingdoms to uproot, to tear down, to destroy, and overthrow, to build and to plant. Jeremiah was daunted by that. And I'm sure we are too. As I said, we all realise that we are works in progress, spiritually speaking. We're not yet who we will one day be. And I think that's why, in the final 6 verses of this chapter, the focus is on the king's refining work among his people. 1 Peter 4 says it's time for judgment to begin with the family of God. And that's what's happening in the final verses of this chapter. It's the purifying work of God's Spirit among his people, preparing us, making us more like him so that we can be useful for him. Now, in Micah's day, there were all sorts of problems in Judah, all sorts of sinful dependency upon worldly things, and we see them listed: horses and chariots, verse 10. Now that stands for military might. Cities and strongholds, verse 11. Now that stands for the affluent and the self-sufficient urban classes. Witchcraft and spells, verse 12. It stands for those superstitious occult practices which people were dabbling in. And carved images and sacred stones, that's verse 13, which stands for the godless false religions that had taken root in the land. In different ways, the people were relying on all these things for their sufficiency, for their enjoyment. They weren't relying on God at all. And the Lord is clear. 4 times in these 4 verses, in my version, I read destroy. It might say in your version, cut off, or a similar word. And it tells us that the Lord isn't going to tread gently here. These aren't things that can, they're not ideal, but we can tolerate them. These are evils, and they need to be totally cut off, purged. And it's going to be painful. There's another phrase that's repeated here several times, from among you. So these aren't just superficial flesh wounds. These are deep, rotting cancers inside the body, and they need to be totally destroyed from the root and removed. And this is a picture of the refining fire of God's judgment. He hasn't given up on his people. He's got his remnant. But for the long-term future of his people, for their sake and for the sake of his own holiness, it's imperative that unclean things are destroyed and removed from among his people. It's an act of love. It's an act of protection. And it returns us to what I said at the beginning, that the nation of Judah had been looking to worldly strategies, to human strength. That's why judgment was about to break. And Micah is trying to say to this godly remnant, your hope is to be found in the Lord. Not military might, not economic strength or finances, not in pseudo-spirituality, not in false religion. Christ alone, the Lord alone, is to be the refuge of his people. He's a jealous and a holy God, just as much as he's a loving God. And he's the same today as he ever was. The Lord loves us. He's given us his Son, the Good Shepherd, who laid down his life for the sheep. He said, I'll never leave you. I'm never going to forsake you. Sometimes we forsake him and we don't want him in our lives, but he says, I'm not forsaking you. But he doesn't want to just leave us as we are, muddling along. He desires for us to increasingly be the people he saved us to be. So, even as he works through us and uses us to be his aroma in this world, the Spirit of Christ will also work in us to test our claim to faith, to bring to light things that need to be brought to light, perhaps things that need to be confessed, to root out things that need to be removed, to purify us. Because ultimately, it's the church's holiness that the world sees. What are we depending on as a church? Finances, worldly strategies, things that we think are either needed or impressive? I think this passage tells us that a holy dependence on Christ alone is what's really needed, and it's what's most noticed in this world. A church can have the biggest car park with double spaces for everybody. You can have the most comfortable facilities. You can have a fantastic website. You can have the biggest worship band ever, and a huge stage and flashing lights, and everyone can think that church building is amazing. A bit like the disciples walking around. Look at the temple stones. Look at Ponsonby Baptist Church. Isn't it amazing what it looks like? But, it's the church's separation from sin. It's the church's purity. That's what the world will see. And that's what the Lord uses for his glory. Not all that superficial stuff. And as we draw to an end, remember that ultimately all of this, so this long second cycle, this chapter 3 all the way through to the end of chapter 5, really, it concerns the fact that the all-seeing Lord is holy. He's apart from sin. He's grieved by an unholy world. He's concerned for his people that they won't be contaminated by the sin all around them. And so in grace, the holy God did full salvation plan. He sent his Son, the shepherd, to deal with the sin problem. And Christ has dealt with the sin problem. He's atoned for it. He's called a people to himself. He's called them his own, his bride, his flock. And he will shepherd them, and he will keep them and protect them and refine them all the way through until that glorious day when God comes down from heaven. And in that day, the church will be spotless and without blemish. and all that is not pure will be dealt with. That's how the chapter ends. I will take vengeance in anger and wrath upon the nations that have not obeyed me. That's in verse 15. And we have an echo of that at the end of Revelation. In Revelation chapters 21 and 22, there's a little picture of God's heavenly city, and it says nothing impure will ever enter it, nor will anyone who does what is shameful or deceitful, but only those whose names are written in the Lamb's book of life. Outside are the dogs, those who practice magic arts, the sexually immoral, the murderers, the idolaters, and everyone who loves and practices falsehood. So there's a warning, I think, here for those in Micah's day who cared nothing for God. And for any of us, if we care more about the world's approval than God's. He is holy, and he will hold unholiness to account. And yet I think there's a wonderful encouragement for the remnant, for the flock, for us. God has a remnant, and he's gone to great lengths to preserve that remnant, to keep them from the wrath to come. And so you see, knowing what we've been saved from, we're to persevere in holiness, to cooperate with the Spirit's work amongst us, because in so doing we will be Christ's instruments for good in this world, his aroma. The smell of life, or the smell of death, but we will be used of Christ. So let's be encouraged. We have a great shepherd who's amongst us today. He's looking out for us. He's with us. But he's also working amongst us to make us more holy. Amen.